Imagine being locked in a subterranean cell beneath the loudest building in the ancient world, the roar of 50,000 strangers passing through the stone above you like an earthquake, while your name does not exist on any ledger that acknowledges you as a person. You are listed only as an item to be distributed at the end of spectacle, a captiva in a bureaucracy of humiliation. This is the story of Sabina, 19 years old, taken after a Roman victory, and through her life and death, we can begin to map how an empire engineered cruelty as policy rather than leaving it to random violence. The Colosseum was not merely an amphitheater, it was a megaphone of power. Its arches framed not only gladiators and beasts, but also a message. The state could make suffering into a public ritual. Games were a mixture of religion, politics, and theater, prayers to gods, displays of military triumph, and a marketplace of human lives. When a general returned victorious, the spoils included slaves, prisoners of war, and sometimes entire communities reduced to numbers on a roll. The moment these people crossed the threshold into Rome, they became part of a system that turned humiliation into entertainment and paperwork. In the autumn following General Marcus Antonius's Eastern campaign, records and later narratives tell us that around 847 captives were paraded in Rome. Among that mass were noblewomen, mothers, girls, individuals whose private lives were erased and whose bodies were entered into public accounting. Sabina was one of them. Sources and reconstruction place her at 19, returned from a town burned in the wake of military success. She had been engaged according to the oral fragments the district scribes later recorded, and in her home she kept a small set of personal objects, a woven belt, a simple hairpin, a token of betrothal. Those possessions in the trauma of capture were stripped away. In the official lists she becomes an entry on a tablet, a captive to be allocated. We cannot build Sabina's inner life as a matter of certainty. That would be another kind of erasure, of the unknown. Instead, we follow the traces left in text and earth, where she was seen, how she was recorded, and where the layers of stone keep the echo of her footsteps. The narrative that follows is an interpretation rooted in sources, texts by Cassius Dio, Tacitus, and Seneca that discuss spectacle and captivity, and anchored by material evidence uncovered in recent archaeological work led by Dr. Isabella Fortunato and her team in 2018 beneath the Colosseum. Where there is debate among historians, I will say so. Where archaeologists have found physical traces, I will describe the finds and the inferences scholars draw from them. On the day of the games, the arena was a stage of licenses. Gladiators fought, animals were set upon each other, and then as a punctuation at a ritualistic crescendo, captives were displayed.
For the crowd, the ritual reduced enemies of Rome to objects of scorn and entertainment. For officials, it was administrative. The distribution of captives functioned like the allocation of land or goods, a reward economy linked to military service. Victors, whether celebrated soldiers or best-selling gladiators, were often given the right to select spoils. This right was both honorific and performative. To claim a captive in front of the populace was to assert dominance and reinforce the social order. The case that forces us to look closely is the moment a celebrated fighter, Gaius Valerius Maximus, a former slave who had climbed to fame in the arena, refused the expected course of action. Gaius had earned a reputation for ferocity and skill. When the order was given for the victors to claim their rewards, one of the options presented as part of the ceremonial spoils was the selection of a captive woman. Sabina, along with another captive recorded in some accounts as Kamosicus, also spelled Kamaskus in certain sources, was led forward, presented before the assembled masses. The ritual expected feigned combat with wooden swords, mock fights intended to humiliate and entertain. The crowd loved such scenes because they inverted power in a controlled setting. Women, noble or otherwise, reduced to playthings for show. But Sabina and Kamosicus did not perform. They refused the mock combat. This refusal was not a theatrical stunt. It was a small, stubborn act of agency, silence and stillness in the face of orchestration. In a system that relied on spectacle, refusal unsettled the mechanics of the show. Guards seized them, and they were moved not back into public view but into subterranean rooms, iron rings fixed into stone, benches fashioned into cells, drainage cuts carved to wash away refuse. The transfer from the bright, sunlit arena to the hypogeum, the maze underneath, was not simply a change of scenery. It was a descent into a parallel economy, a purpose-built infrastructure for processing captive bodies out of sight. Archaeological evidence from the 2018 excavation under the Colosseum provides critical context for this descent. Dr. Isabella Fortunato's team uncovered chambers carved into the substructure, with iron fittings anchored in the walls and fixed rings at intervals that would have allowed shackling. They found fragments of bronze tags and small stamped markers that, according to the reporting archaeologists, match the type used as inventory or ownership markers in other contexts. These finds do not and cannot prove beyond all doubt that every ring or tag belonged to victims of spectacle in a single event, but they suggest that the hypogeum included spaces organized for temporary detention and handling, spaces that could be repurposed for the management of prisoners when public theater required it. The documentary and textual layers align in troubling ways.
Cassius Dio and Tacitus write about the public display of captives as part of triumphal rituals. Seneca judges the spectacle with moral alarm in his letters. The texts often treat captivity as an accepted instrument of statecraft. At the same time, the material record, architectural features, small finds, the way drainage was engineered, points to routine practices, not improvised cruelty. When an infrastructure is built with fittings for chains and channels for effluent, it indicates a system anticipating a regular need to hold, transfer, and control human beings out of the public eye. Scholars debate how often captives experience the specific humiliations described in literary sources, and rightly so. Ancient authors had their own agendas. But the existence of purpose-built subterranean facilities beneath the most public building in Rome raises questions that cannot be ignored. The bureaucratic language of the empire softened the brutality. Scribes kept lists, captives were assigned tags. The term taptiva appears in records to signal a kind of administrative property. In the paperwork, the human is replaced by a category. That archival process absolved some actors. Trainers, bureaucrats, and magistrates could argue they were merely following procedure. They could claim that allocation was ceremonial, or that rewards were customary. The ritual framing served not only to justify but to normalize. Into that normalization entered Gas's refusal, not the refusal of the captives, but his refusal to claim the expected prize. Gas, who had himself once been property, observed in the privacy of a chamber the state's mechanism at work. According to reconstructed accounts, he asked to speak with Sabina. The content of that exchange survives only as fragments in later commentaries and as the moralizing stories that ancient writers like to tell, a tough man confronted with the human cost of his reward. Whether Gas's motives were compassion, guilt, or something more complicated, he registered a rupture with the expected course of spectacle. In one version of the story, he declared Sabina ill, an administrative loophole that allowed him to have her removed from the immediate list for distribution and to transfer her to a physician's care. The word ill here is significant. It transformed a public object into a private patient. It changed the mode of containment, but it did not necessarily change the outcome. The irony of so-called mercy is brutal in its realism. Sabina was sent to a physician. Medical care in antiquity could be rudimentary. Wounds could fester, and infectious complications were common where trauma, immobility, and poor sanitation intersected. The records indicate that Sabina later died in custody of complications, a phrase that in our sources is often a euphemism. Archaeological reports and medical historians suggest that infection, untreated or insufficiently treated, was a leading cause of death after traumatic injuries in antiquity.
Whether Sabina's death resulted from a botched medical intervention, neglect, or conditions in detention, the result underlines a grim truth. A system that organizes violence invariably also organizes neglect. Gas's act of intervention, therefore, becomes morally ambiguous. It was a refusal of immediate abuse, but not a fundamental challenge to the system that produced the abuse. Scholars have long debated the moral weight of such acts. Some historians argue that individual decency in the form of a single act matters because it interrupts the cycle and creates space for dispute. Others point out that isolated acts can be co-opted by spectacle. The story of Gas who saves a captive might even be used as a dramaturgical device to humanize the arena and absolve spectators. In the historical record, Gas's choice does provoke backlash. Trainers and administrators, whose incomes and reputations were tied to successful spectacles, complained that gladiators should not be permitted to subvert the expected outcomes. The trainers disciplined those who refused rewards, arguing that the social contract of spectacle demanded conformity. That conflict crossed over into the political sphere. According to our textual sources, a senator named Quintus Aurelius Semicus brought the grievance to the Senate floor. He framed it as a public order problem. If victors refused their honors, the authority of spectacle could be undermined and the crowd dissatisfied. Another senator, Fabius, took a conservative stance, insisting that existing customs should be upheld and that private decisions by gladiators should not dictate the conduct of public rites. The debate exposed a deeper anxiety. The games were not mere diversion.
They were a primary medium through which Rome asserted its authority and cultivated its citizenry's loyalty. Out of this quarrel emerged a legislative response that historians and writers have called the Lex Captivity, dated in records to October 1, 79 AD. The new law sought to curb the public distribution and degradation of captive women as part of entertainment, restricting the explicit allocation in the arena. The Lex Captivity is, in many ways, an ambiguous victory. It recognized a problem, but also left substantial room for private exploitation. The law prohibited formal public distribution during games, but did not outlaw other means of transfer. Sources indicate that private sales, domestic exploitation, and informal arrangements persisted. Enforcement was uneven and often depended on local magistrates' willingness to prosecute. The Lex Captivity thus signals both a moral tipping point in public discourse and the limits of legislative remedies when economic and social incentives are stacked in favor of exploitation. It is important to stress that historians debate the scope and effect of the Lex Captivity. Some argue that it marked a significant cultural shift in which public sensibilities moved against overt theatrical humiliation.
Others contend that the law was performative, a way for elites to signal concern while preserving the underlying structures of power that made exploitation profitable. Archaeological findings do not offer a simple confirmation or contradiction. The hypogeum's continued use and later modifications suggest that the subterranean spaces remained active sites of storage, stagecraft, and containment. The bronze tags and iron fittings discovered are consistent with ongoing operational needs under an evolving set of rules. In other words, architecture and artifacts show continuity, even where laws attempted to change practice. When we examine the hypogeum itself, the physical details are telling. The spaces beneath the arena were not a single cavern, but a complex network of chambers, corridors, ramps, pulleys, and holding areas designed to manipulate the visible narrative above. Trapdoors, lifts, and passageways allowed animals and performers to appear and disappear with theatrical precision. These features are often described in reconstructions of how animals were brought into the arena or how sets were changed. But the same architecture could, and apparently did, serve the needs of controlling human bodies. The rooms unearthed show benches worn by use, cuttings for drainage, and fittings that allowed for temporary restraint. Drainage channels suggest a pragmatic expectation. These rooms were sites of bodily functions and waste, not honor. The presence of refuse deposits and small personal items indicates that people were kept there long enough for possessions to accumulate or be discarded. There is an ethical urgency in the archaeological layer. Excavation rescues anonymity. When Dr. Fortunato's team pieced together fragments, tags, chains, ceiling pins, they were not merely cataloging objects, they were restoring a material dimension to lives that textual sources often marginalize. The archaeology complicates the narrative that public games were an entirely elevated ritual affair, detached from mundane administration. It shows that the mechanism of spectacle required management, records, inventory, containment, and that management left traces. Yet we must exercise caution. The presence of shackles or tags under the Colosseum does not prove that each item belonged to a captive exhibited during a single procession. Archaeology gives patterns, not spotless chains of proof. Some scholars rightly warn against corralling artifacts into neat stories that overstate causality. That caution, however, should not tilt into complacency. The combined weight of textual testimony and physical infrastructure creates a convincing picture. The imperial apparatus was capable of standardizing and routinizing humiliation. This routinization extended beyond physical infrastructure into the symbolic economy. The spectacle produced categories of humanity. To stand as a captive in the arena was to be publicly declared an inferior social category.
The law and ritual transformed enemies or outsiders into display objects. Their names were placed by labels. When a scribal clerk recorded captiva next to an item, he was performing an act with social consequences. Language mattered because it structured what could be done to a person with legal and social sanction. The apparatus of distribution, the lists, tags, and ceremonial presentations, disguised brutality as orthodoxy. Consider the metaphor of marble above and stone below. The Colosseum's elegant arches, marble veneers, and imperial inscriptions declared Rome's greatness. Beneath that veneer, however, the hypogeum's rough-hewn rooms were built for labor, containment, and utility. The juxtaposition is not merely architectural, it is moral. Civilization creates grandeur and, at the same time, builds the machinery that produces degradations it would rather hide. This fact challenges the comforting binary that equates cultural achievements with moral progress. An empire can build arenas and libraries, poets and law codes, while simultaneously institutionalizing harm. There are other human stories threaded into this web. Colosseum, recorded in variant forms in our textual fragments, shared stages with Sabina, refusing mock combat and facing similar processes of management and paperwork. Some victors used captives as props for self-glorification. Others saw them as potential domestic laborers. A few, like Gas, attempted to bend the system, if only marginally. The spectrum of responses within Rome ranged from applause to dissent, from lucrative private dealings to legislative restraint. Each actor, crowd, magistrate, trainer, victor, played a role in reproducing or contesting the pattern. The moral of the story is not that all Romans were callous or that legal reform was impossible. It is more complex. The Senate's debate over spectacle shows that there were public arguments about decency and public order. Seneca's moral essays expressed disgust at certain excesses of spectacle and at the appetite for cruelty. These voices suggest that ethical standards existed and that some elites recognized a problem. But recognition did not automatically translate into structural change. Economic interests, cultural assumptions, and the inertia of institutional practice often blunt the force of moral indignation. How should we remember Sabina? Memory in this case is methodological. We blend fragments into reconstruction, but we always mark where facts end and interpretation begins. We must resist two temptations: to fictionalize her into a dramatic heroine whose life we can fully know, and to anonymize her into a statistic. The historian's duty is to restore humanity within evidentiary constraint. When we name Sabina and tell what is likely her path, from capture to the arena, to the hypogeum, to the medical ward and eventual death from infection, we reinsert a singular life into a system that sought to efface individuality.
There is a contemporary sting to this recovery. The Colosseum is an iconic monument, visited by millions. Its image circulates as a symbol of antiquity and tourist wonder. Few visitors pause long enough to consider the subterranean lives that made the spectacle possible. When we look at marble now, it is tempting to admire engineering without recognizing the human costs embedded in that engineering. How many monuments, ancient or modern, carry analogous shadows? The question is not meant to collapse eras or to equate institutions across centuries. It is meant to urge vigilance. When societies create systems that incentivize the commodification of people, whether through law, architecture, or market structures, the moral hazard is persistent. If you have stayed with this account to this point, then you already know why we tell these stories: to ensure that names like Sabina do not vanish into the generalities of history. If you want deeper historical investigations like this one, please like and subscribe. There is more to uncover, and this channel depends on viewers who care about hidden histories. The story of captive women in Rome forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Was the spectacle an aberration or an expression of governance? Evidence suggests it was an expression, not chaos but policy, an intersection of law, economy, and theatrical performance that made public humiliation legible and administratively manageable. The lex captivity tried to regulate the public elements of that machinery, but law without consistent enforcement and without addressing the underlying incentives cannot wholly transform a system. Archaeology gives us a blunt corrective to rhetorical erasure. The hypogeum's iron fittings and the bronze tags recovered in 2018 are mute witnesses. They do not cry out, but they persist. Their persistence insists that we take seriously how states can design environments that condition behavior. The fact that spaces beneath the monument were constructed to hold people, temporarily, invisibly, complicates the romance of empire. It also challenges us today. Monuments and institutions are built by choices. Choices shape how a society treats its weakest members. There is another lesson in the story of Gas and Sabina. Individual acts of decency can matter, but they are not substitutes for structural change. Gas's choice to declare Sabina ill and thereby spare her immediate distribution was a moment of moral courage or self-interest, or both. It does not erase the system that produced the need for such choices. Acts of individual mercy can illuminate the problem and humanize victims, but long-term remediation requires altering incentives, legal frameworks, and cultural norms. In remembering Sabina, we perform a small corrective. We retrieve a face from the margins, and we use it to interrogate the machinery that produced her suffering.
Historical work, grounded in both texts and trenches, gives us tools to ask better questions. What infrastructures bind cruelty and respectability? How do legal categories enable dehumanization? What do ordinary bureaucratic forms, lists, tags, seals, tell us about how societies classify human beings? This investigation is not an exercise in moral superiority. It is a sober recognition that civilized achievements can coexist with institutionalized cruelty. The Colosseum's grandeur cannot be disentangled from what happened beneath it. To look away is to let the machinery continue unexamined. To remember Sabina is to insist that the names of those lost to spectacle be restored, as far as evidence permits, and that the systems that made such losses routine be scrutinized. Tell us in the comments which part of this history unsettled you most. If you want to dig deeper, check the description for sources and further reading on the archaeological report from 2018 and the primary ancient accounts. Remembering is a responsibility. When we lift the stone and listen, the past speaks in fragments. It is our task to assemble them with care, restraint, and respect, for Sabina and for all whose names barely survive the ledger.